And I'm going to go back to what I laid out before. I mean, I think a number of these issues are interrelated. On the one hand, you've got, I think, an imperative to have an overall housing strategy for this country, but you have to take into account other associated inputs to that, and we talked a little bit about transit earlier. I do think that the emphasis here, though, on this particular question about the rate of development, where that development goes, is more primarily a local government and regional government decision. But nevertheless, I think the federal government can be a player. I think Metro Vancouver has done a very good job over the years of trying to cope with that growth issue in terms of the livable region plan, the town centres, and we've seen much of that actually take place in Metro Vancouver in a very successful way that many other urban areas have not been able to deal with. I think the strategy of like preserving our farmland that goes way back to the NDP in the 70s is now really, we're seeing the good consequences of those sound public policy decisions. We are talking about the livability of our region. So I think the federal government is a participant in that. I don't think that they're the lead player in where that actual growth goes in terms of immigration. We do know that there's the provincial nominee program, for example, under immigration. So what I come back to is just the underlying need to have a process that allows these things to be inputted, to have a rational public policy decision. Why don't we have that? Why isn't it working the way it should? I think that's what you're asking for. Certainly other groups that I work for are asking for that. So that's what we need to arrive at.
Well, yes, the federal government has the role to play in immigration, but we also participate with it in provinces, and that there is the PNP plans in which the provinces also say what kinds of immigrants they want and where they want to have them go. So that we have to talk to each other about this and set up a solid way of dealing with housing for new immigrants. The federal government has a huge role to play in that. We could transfer money to the provinces, or we could actually be partners with them in creating immigrant housing and refugee housing. That is our role, it's our responsibility as a federal government. But I wanted to point out something. We've asked specific questions here that sometimes cannot have very fixed and specific and narrow answers. Housing is a complex issue. And sometimes if you ask a question on one issue, you have to be able to look at how it impacts on other people. So the question on RRSPs, for instance, while you would say, well, the federal government expanded, the federal government has to consider if everybody gets to use that, and how do we actually influence housing with people who can't afford RRSPs. So you can't just answer it, but it's a black and white issue. You have to talk about the other ways. I mean, the federal government under Chrétien did introduce a reverse mortgage to allow seniors and older people to have reverse mortgages with regard to their homes. So we think that also worked quite well.
I'm glad we're having this discussion about this issue, because I think it is an extraordinarily important issue for the future. It will only become more important. The Green Party's position around immigration is this, that we support expanded immigration, the reunification of families, more importantly adding a category to the Immigration Act which would enable environmental refugees, because climate change, the scientists are predicting up to 200 million, maybe more, immigrants, refugees, will result, and Canada needs to take on fair share of that responsibility of bringing in and accepting those immigrants. So the question is, where are we going to house the people? Will we have sufficient housing stock? I think Libby Davies is absolutely right. We cannot expand into what is equally precious to housing, and that is the land base upon which we grow our food. And that has been a problem in the Lower Mainland, and we have to keep that farmland in production. It's only going to become more important again with the growing crises around food production and climate change. There are some jurisdictions in Portland and in some of the states that have urban growth boundaries. Maybe we should include that in the discussion. That means that you end up in the discussion of density within an urban area. That's what an urban growth boundary is all about. You've probably seen in Vancouver some controversy over eco-density, but I do think we need to, the Green Party believes we need to move in that direction. Compact urban growth, compact urban development is something that we are at the leading edge of discussing globally. I think we should be a center for the discussion of that and the kind of new housing designs that could go along with it.
One thing I would say is that immigration, particularly for British Columbia, particularly for those of us in the Lower Mainland, is a huge part of the lifeblood of our economy. And the effective management of expectations and welcoming newcomers and balancing these out with growth strategies of municipalities is something that's essential. You know, this year Canada welcomed 281,000 new Canadians this year. The largest increase of new Canadians this year than any other year before in Canadian history. And we're one of the only countries in the G20, one of the only countries that actually increased immigration in a time of recession. So we're welcoming new Canadians, and I think that this is happening, and it's happening well, because these partnerships and these conversations and dialogues do exist. You know, it used to be that it was only Quebec, because their unique dynamic with regard to managing immigration, only Quebec had a Minister of Immigration. Now almost all provinces do, because all provinces recognize that new Canadians are coming here in all parts of the country. It's not just urban centres, but they're coming to Canada for all kinds of different reasons, and they want to contribute, be upwardly mobile, and be fully engaged in Canadian society. And I think the way that provinces have stepped up with actual, in the most part, ministers of immigration, or something akin to that, and working with the federal counterpart to make sure that new Canadians have settlement services, access to housing, access to their needs, and that we have some coordination between all levels of government, is something that has served all of Canadians, I think, very well.